Imagine it's the 14th of August, 1997. You are a 34-year-old schoolteacher living in Lahore, Pakistan. Your name is Tariq. You wake up every morning at 6, drink your chai, and walk your two daughters to school before heading to the government secondary school where you have taught mathematics for 11 years. You earn about 4,000 rupees a month. It is not a fortune, but it is steady. You have been saving carefully for 3 years to buy a small plot of land on the outskirts of the city. You have a fixed deposit account at Habib Bank. You trust it completely. You trust the rupee completely. You trust the system completely. It has always been there, like the sun rising over the minarets each morning. If you have ever looked at your Pakistani rupees and wondered why they seem to buy less and less every single year, no matter how hard you work, no matter how carefully you save, stay with me. What you're about to hear is not a political opinion. It is not a theory invented in a university classroom. It is a structural pattern, a mechanical sequence of cause and effect that has played out in country after country, decade after decade, across 4 continents. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and the end is always the same. If this kind of deep economic clarity is what you look for in a channel, subscribing takes 2 seconds, and it will keep you far ahead of what most people never see coming. Now, back to Tariq. He does not know it yet, but on this particular morning, Pakistan's 50th Independence Day, the government in Islamabad is quietly negotiating with the International Monetary Fund behind closed doors. The rupee has already been under pressure for months. The foreign exchange reserves, the dollars and pounds the government holds to keep the economy running, are dangerously low. Within the next 12 months, the rupee will lose more than 30% of its value against the dollar. By 1998, Pakistan will conduct nuclear tests that trigger international sanctions. By 1999, there will be a military coup. Tariq's savings, which he had calculated would buy him that plot of land by the year 2000, will no longer be enough. The price of the land will rise with inflation. The value of his rupees will fall. The gap between his savings and his dream will grow like a river swallowing its own banks. This video is about why that happened. Not the politics, not the bombs, not the generals, but the structural, mechanical, almost invisible reason that the Pakistani rupee has been losing value for 75 years, and why it is likely to keep doing so until something fundamental changes. Before we go further, there is something important to understand. A currency, any currency, is not just paper, it is a promise. It is a claim on the productive capacity of the economy that issues it. When you hold a 100 rupee note, you are holding a promise from the government of Pakistan that this note represents real value, real goods, real services, real output from real people doing real work. The problem begins when the promise exceeds the reality. When more notes are printed, then there is real economic output to back them up. Think of it this way. Imagine a bakery that sells 100 loaves of bread, and there are exactly 100 tokens in circulation, each worth 1 loaf. Now imagine the bakery owner prints 50 more tokens, but bakes no extra bread. Suddenly, each token can only buy 2/3 of a loaf. The tokens lost value, not because anyone stole anything, not because of bad luck, but because the supply of tokens grew faster than the supply of bread. This is the oldest trick in the economic playbook, and it is the core mechanism behind what has happened to the Pakistani rupee for 7 decades. The question is, why does it keep happening? And the answer goes much deeper than printing money. This brings us directly to the first major structural problem. Pakistan, for most of its existence as a nation, has spent more money than it earns, every year, without exception. Economists call this a fiscal deficit, which simply means the government's spending is larger than its tax revenue. The gap has to be filled somehow, and in Pakistan's case, the gap has been filled in 3 ways: borrowing from abroad, borrowing from domestic banks, and, most destructively, instructing the State Bank of Pakistan to simply create new money. Let us look at what this looks like in practice, using a case study not from Pakistan, but from a country that followed almost the exact same playbook. Look at what happened in Argentina between 1975 and 1989. Argentina had a government that was spending far beyond its means, had a military junta, then a democratic government, each inheriting the debts of the one before it. The deficit, the gap between what the government earned in taxes and what it spent, kept growing. And to fill that T-gap, Argentina did exactly what Pakistan has repeatedly done. It instructed its central bank to print money, lots of it. In 1975, Argentina's annual inflation rate hit 182%. That means prices were doubling almost every 5 months. By 1989, under a different government still unable to break the cycle, inflation reached 3,079% in a single year. 3,079%. A bag of rice that cost 100 pesos in January cost 3,100 pesos by December. People began receiving their wages and sprinting to the market before the money lost even more value by afternoon. Ordinary Argentines, Teachers, nurses, factory workers watched their savings melt away like ice on a summer pavement. The savings did not disappear in a single dramatic moment. They vanished slowly, then suddenly, drip by drip, and then all at once. Now observe the parallel with Pakistan. In 1947, when Pakistan was created, the exchange rate was approximately 3.3 rupees to $1. By 1971, it had moved to around 4.76, still manageable. But then the dam began to crack. By 1982, it was around 11 rupees to the dollar. By 2000, it was 52. By 2018, it was 115. By 2023, it touched 300 rupees to a single US dollar. The rupee had lost roughly 99% of its value against the dollar since independence. This was not an accident. It was not a natural disaster. It was the predictable output of a system that kept spending more than it earned, kept printing money to cover the gap, and kept hoping the problem would solve itself. It never does. A currency in slow collapse is not a fire. It is a river quietly changing course. By the time most people notice the riverbed is dry, it has already moved somewhere else entirely. Here is something I want you to think about before we go further. If Pakistan has known about this structural problem for decades, if economists, the IMF, and independent analysts have been saying the same things over and over since at least the 1970s, why has nothing fundamentally changed? Is it because the people in charge did not know the solution? Or is it because fixing the problem would require giving up something that those in power were not willing to give up? Drop your answer in the comments. Seriously, think about it before you type. Because what I am about to show you next is the part of this story that most people never hear. The part that sits behind the currency charts and the IMF press releases. And it changes everything about how you see this situation. This leads to the second part of this story. The structural problem is not just about printing money. It goes deeper. It is about the tax base, meaning the number of people and businesses actually paying taxes into the government's treasury. Pakistan has one of the lowest tax to GDP ratios in the world. Tax to GDP ratio simply means for every 100 rupees of total economic activity happening in the country, how many rupees does the government collect in taxes? In Pakistan, this figure has historically hovered between 9 and 12%. Compare this to countries like Turkey at about 18%, India at around 17%, or the average for developing economies of about 15 to 16%. Why does this matter? Because a government that cannot collect enough taxes from its own economy cannot fund itself without either borrowing or printing money, and both paths, when overused, destroy the currency. To understand why this tax base is so weak, look at what happened in Turkey in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Turkey had a similar structural problem, a large informal economy, meaning millions of workers and businesses that operated outside the formal system and paid no taxes, a powerful agricultural sector that was legally exempt from income tax, and an elite class of industrialists and landowners with enough political influence to keep the tax code from ever truly reaching them. The Turkish lira fell from 1,500 per US dollar in 1995 to 1,750,000 per dollar by 2001. The country eventually redenominated its currency, which means it knocked 6 zeros off the lira and started over. But the structural problems that caused the collapse in the first place were still there underneath. Turkey had to keep going to the IMF for bailouts in 1994, 1999, and 2001. Each time the IMF came with conditions: reduce spending, increase taxes, stop printing money. Each time the government agreed, implemented some reforms, and then slowly slid back into old habits the moment the crisis pressure eased. Pakistan's relationship with the IMF is almost identical in structure. As of 2023, Pakistan had entered into at least 22 separate IMF programs since 1958. 22. Every single one came with conditions. Every single one produced some temporary stabilization. And every single one was followed, eventually, by another crisis requiring another program. Why? Because the structural problem, a government that cannot fund itself through legitimate taxation, was never fully fixed. The landowning elites in Punjab and Sindh, who hold enormous agricultural wealth, have historically paid little to no income tax. A 2019 study estimated that Pakistan loses approximately 700 billion rupees per year in potential tax revenue from the agricultural sector alone. 700 billion rupees sitting uncollected because the political class that owns that land is the same political class that writes the tax laws. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a structural conflict of interest, meaning the people with the power to fix the problem are the people who benefit most from it staying broken. Think of it like a house where the roof is leaking badly, and the landlord owns both the house and the roofing company. Every time it rains, the tenants suffer. The landlord collects money for emergency repairs. But the roof never quite gets fixed, because fixing it permanently would end the landlord's most reliable source of income. At this point, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. But there is a third structural layer that most discussions of Pakistan's currency crisis completely miss, and it is the one that locks all the other problems in place. Pakistan is a country that imports far more than it exports. This is called a current account deficit, meaning the country spends more foreign currency buying things from abroad than it earns selling things to the world. Pakistan's major exports are textiles, leather goods, and a few agricultural commodities, like rice and cotton. But its imports include petroleum, machinery, chemicals, and edible oils. The country is essentially a net buyer on the global market. Every year it needs billions of dollars to pay for those imports. Dollars that it earns through exports, remittances, the money sent home by Pakistanis working abroad, and foreign borrowing. Look at what happened to Egypt between 2011 and 2016 as an almost perfect mirror. After the Arab Spring of 2011, Egypt lost a significant portion of its foreign currency earnings, tourism revenues collapsed, foreign investment dried up, the Suez Canal revenues were lower than expected. The Egyptian pound came under intense pressure. Egypt's central bank burned through its foreign reserves, the stockpile of dollars it held to defend the pound's value, trying to hold the exchange rate stable. By 2016, the reserves were nearly gone. Egypt had to go to the IMF for an emergency loan of $12 billion. The condition? Let the pound float freely, meaning stop trying to control the exchange rate artificially. The moment Egypt did this in November 2016, the pound lost almost 50% of its value against the dollar in a single day. Prices of imported goods doubled overnight. Ordinary Egyptians, the civil servants, the small shopkeepers, the families buying cooking oil and medicine, paid the price of a structural imbalance they had played no part in creating. Pakistan has repeated this sequence so many times it has become almost mechanical. The State Bank of Pakistan tries to hold the rupee's value artificially high to control inflation. This makes imports cheap and exports expensive on world markets, which makes the trade deficit worse. The country burns through its foreign reserves defending an exchange rate it cannot sustain. Then, eventually, the reserves run out, the rupee collapses, and everyone who held rupees loses a portion of their wealth in a matter of weeks. In 2022 and 2023, Pakistan's foreign exchange reserves fell to levels that could barely cover 4 weeks of imports. The rupee fell from approximately 180 to the dollar in early 2022 to above 300 to the dollar by early 2023. That is nearly a 40% collapse in purchasing power, meaning the same salary now bought 40% less of the world's goods in 1 year. Most people will never know what you now know. Most people will look at currency charts and see random fluctuations. They will listen to politicians blame external forces, rising oil prices, American interest rates, the global economy, and some of those external forces are real. But they are not the root cause. The root cause has been sitting in the same place for 75 years. If you are still here, you are not most people. Subscribe. Because the next section is the part this channel was made for. The part they never put in textbooks. The part where we look at who actually suffers when a currency dies slowly, and who walks away fine. Now here's where it gets interesting. When a currency loses value slowly and steadily over decades, the damage is not evenly distributed. It falls almost entirely on one group of people, and it spares almost entirely another. The group that suffers most is the group that trusts the currency completely. The savers, the salaried workers, the pensioners, the people who do exactly what they were told to do. Work hard, put money in the bank, save for the future. In Pakistan, this is the schoolteacher like Tariq, the retired government servant, the woman who ran a small tailoring business and put her profits in a savings account. These people hold rupees. They believe rupees will buy them something in the future. Every year the rupee falls, their future gets quietly smaller. Their savings lose real value even if the number in their bank account stays the same or even grows slightly. A savings account paying 10% interest sounds good until you realize inflation is running at 25%. In real terms, meaning after accounting for the rising cost of everything, you lost 15% of your purchasing power that year, while sitting still, while doing everything right. This pattern appeared with devastating clarity in Lebanon beginning in 2019. Lebanon had maintained an artificial peg of its currency to the US dollar for more than 20 years. The Lebanese pound was fixed at 1,507 to the dollar. Ordinary Lebanese, doctors, engineers, shopkeepers, kept their life savings in Lebanese pounds and Lebanese bank accounts because the peg made it feel as safe as holding dollars. When the banking system collapsed in late 2019 and 2020, depositors discovered their savings were trapped. Banks imposed informal capital controls, meaning you could not withdraw your own money. The Lebanese pound on the black market fell to more than 90,000 to the dollar by 2022. A retired schoolteacher who had saved the equivalent of $100,000 in Lebanese pounds found herself holding something worth less than $2,000 in real purchasing power. She had not done anything wrong. She had simply trusted a system that had been structurally broken for years without anyone officially admitting it. The contrast with who survives is equally sharp. In Lebanon, those who had moved their dollars into foreign accounts before the collapse, or who owned real estate abroad, or who held physical gold, kept their wealth essentially intact. In Pakistan, across the decades, those who held US dollars, either in foreign currency accounts or physically in cash, preserved their purchasing power far better than those who held rupees. Those who owned agricultural land, whose value tends to rise with inflation, saw their net worth actually increase in nominal terms. Those who had taken on fixed-rate rupee debt, borrowed rupees and used them to buy hard assets, effectively watched their debt shrink in real terms as inflation eroded its value. The currency fell, their assets rose, the debt shrank. The math worked beautifully for them. It worked devastatingly against everyone who only had rupees. In Argentina's 1989 hyperinflation, similar patterns emerged with almost eerie precision. Upper middle-class families who owned property in Buenos Aires or who had US dollar accounts abroad came through the crisis with their financial position largely intact. Industrial workers and pensioners who held peso savings lost the majority of their accumulated wealth within a single year. This is the cruel irony of currency collapse. It is often described as a national catastrophe affecting everyone equally. But it does not affect everyone equally. It is a wealth transfer, from those who hold the weakening currency to those who hold the assets that strengthen against it. The question is not whether this pattern will repeat. History has already answered that. The only question is whether you will see it before it sees you. Pakistan's rupee has lost value against the dollar in every single decade, since independence without a single exception. The structural conditions that produce this loss, a chronically high fiscal deficit, an extremely low tax base, a persistent trade imbalance, and a political class unwilling to reform the system that privileges them, have not been resolved. They have been managed, barely, through a rotating door of IMF programs and temporary stabilizations. If this channel helps you think differently about the economic world you live in, subscribe. It costs nothing. And for some people, that kind of pattern recognition has changed everything. Now here's what the historical record actually shows about people who came through currency crises in better shape than others. Not what they were told to do, but what they actually did. What history documents, looking back across Argentina, Turkey, Lebanon, Egypt, and Pakistan itself. The first common characteristic is that they reduced their concentration in the weakening currency long before the crisis became obvious to everyone. This is not a prediction skill. It is a structural observation skill. They looked at the trade deficit, the fiscal deficit, the foreign reserve levels, and the debt to GDP ratio, which means the total debt of the country compared to the size of its economy. And they recognized that the math did not add up. In Turkey, in the late 1990s, a small number of educated middle-class families moved portions of their savings into dollar-denominated accounts before the 2001 lira collapse. They did not know exactly when the collapse would come. They simply recognized that a currency under that kind of structural pressure would eventually have to give way. The second common characteristic is that they held assets with real productive value or limited supply. Land is the oldest and most repeated example in economic history. During Weimar, Germany's hyperinflation of 1923, when Germany printed money so aggressively that the exchange rate went from 4 marks to the dollar in 1914 to 4.2 trillion marks to the dollar by November 1923, those who owned farmland, factories, or physical commodities saw their real wealth survive. Those who held government bonds and savings accounts denominated in marks lost almost everything. The same pattern appeared in Zimbabwe's hyperinflation of 2007 and 2008, where the official inflation rate exceeded 230 million% by July 2008. People who owned cattle, land, or foreign currency preserved real value. People who held Zimbabwe dollars watched those dollars become so worthless that the government eventually printed a $100 trillion note. A number so large, it almost becomes a philosophical statement about what happens when a currency loses its connection to reality entirely. The third common characteristic of those who came through these periods better than others is that they maintained mobility, meaning access to income or savings outside the system under pressure. In Pakistan's case, this has historically meant families with relatives working abroad who sent remittances in foreign currency or professionals with skills that could be sold in international markets. Diaspora connections have functioned as an informal insurance policy for millions of Pakistani families. The rupee falls. The remittance in dollars buys more rupees when converted. The family's real purchasing power is actually protected by the currency's weakness. This is a deeply counterintuitive fact. For the families who depend on foreign remittances, a weaker rupee is not entirely bad news. It means their dollars go further inside Pakistan. It is one of the stranger structural dynamics in the Pakistani economy. But for the tens of millions who have no diaspora connection, no dollar savings, and no hard assets, who live entirely inside the rupee system, the slow collapse of the currency is a silent tax. A tax on their patience, a tax on their trust, a tax on the very discipline of saving. Now bring it back to Tariq, the school teacher in Lahore, the man who woke up on Pakistan's 50th Independence Day with a savings account and a dream. By 2002, 5 years after our opening scene, Tariq still had risen with inflation. His salary had increased modestly, the government gave periodic raises, but never fast enough to keep up with the cost of the land. He eventually bought a small piece of property further from the city than he had originally wanted. It was not the dream, but it was something. He was luckier than many. He had a government job with pension benefits. His family had survived, without catastrophic losses. But the savings he had accumulated, the money he had set aside month by month, cup of chai by cup of chai, walk to school by walk to school, had quietly bought him less than he had planned, not because he did anything wrong, not because he was careless or uneducated or naive, but because the structural system he was saving inside was and remains broken in a particular and predictable way. There is a phrase that economists sometimes use. Currency depreciation is a hidden default. It means that when a government cannot pay its debts or fund its promises, it does not always declare bankruptcy openly and honestly. Instead, it inflates, it prints more money, and allows the currency to weaken. The debt stays the same in number, but the real value of that debt falls as the currency falls. The government effectively pays its creditors and its people in money that is worth less than what was borrowed or promised. It is default in slow motion. It is a broken promise dressed in the clothes of an ordinary market event. Pakistan has done this repeatedly, and the people who bear the cost are not the ones who made the promises. They are the ones who believed them. This is historical and educational analysis. It is not financial advice. Every individual situation is different. The patterns described in this video are drawn from documented historical events and economic data spanning multiple countries and several decades. They describe what has happened. They do not predict with certainty what will happen next. Anyone considering any financial decisions based on any of what they have heard here should consult a qualified professional who understands their specific personal circumstances before doing anything at all. This video is not for everyone. Most people will scroll past it or stop watching after 2 minutes. But if one person in your life, a friend who keeps all their savings in a single currency without understanding why it keeps losing value, a family member who trusts a system without understanding its structure, a young person just starting to think about money in the future, if one person in your life needs to hear this, share it with them. Not because it will change the world, because it might change their world. Subscribe for more, and I will see you in the next one.